Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to another round of OAuth Happy Hour. I'm Aaron Parecki, and we've got Micah Silverman here as well.
Hey, everybody.
So today we've got only a little bit of a plan, but always happy to answer questions from everyone in the chat. So bring your OAuth questions if you do have any questions about OAuth or OpenID Connect, or even just API security or web security in general. Go ahead and drop them in the chat. But I guess we should start with a quick update on OAuth 2.1, following up from last week's session. So OAuth 2.1 is the effort that I'm leading with a few others to consolidate and update the OAuth 2 spec based on the current best practices in the OAuth world. So um, since last week, we've now actually published a new version. So I think I showed a sneak peek of what I was working on this stream, and that was not actually published yet, but it is up now. So if you are interested in reading it, actually, let me share my screen here so we can see it real quick. Um, this screen, and so this is the latest update published just a few days ago. It should read pretty similar, but if you are curious what the difference is, you can actually see this nice diff view. And this will show you the exact changes between versions. So including all of the little changes that don't matter, like these dates. But yeah, we've added a new security consideration here. We've deleted the IANA registry because that didn't matter because we weren't actually doing anything new here. And then this is actually, I'm really excited about this addition to the appendix, actually. The extensions. Oh, that's not going to search well. Let me go to the actual document. We added a list of extensions that are like well-known, established extensions now. And you can actually go and from the idea is, again, to help people better navigate the space, right? So now if you start here and you're reading about OAuth, you'll actually now see like, oh, here are some of the other things we can do in the space instead of having to go find the OAuth group and search for RFCs that way or whatever, right? So this is a lot more organized, along with a little description of each one. So this is some of these are still experimental, like these two. We've been talking about these for a little bit, but these are the ones that we expect people will want to know about that aren't necessarily actually part of the core. And along with that, extensions, the text in the draft, let's see if I can find an example. There's now a lot of references to those extensions in line in the text. So if we look for, let me see, there's like, no, not that's Pixie, where we've got like, where is it? Where did it go? Well, like, access tokens. So when, yeah, here we go. So, access tokens, before it said that they're just opaque and everything else is out of scope. And now we're like, okay, here's an example. One example of a structured access token format is defined by this other RFC. Or not RFC yet, still a draft, but another spec talks about one way to do structured access tokens, as well as now reference to mutual TLS. So this is, again, subtle, minor differences, but the idea is to make this document a little bit more readable and help actually navigate and see, find out where the rest of the specs are that you might be interested in. So hopefully that's helpful to folks. But yeah, everything else in here, I think we've pretty much covered as far as the functionality that we've talked about, the update. We talked about that last week. And yeah, so this is now waiting for comments from people on the list. And with any luck, we'll be able to do a call for adoption on this document in the very near future.
I have a question.
Yeah.
If token introspection is an extension, what does the core say that that resource servers are supposed to do with tokens to understand what they
Mm.
represent?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the core says that it is not in scope of the core. And the reason is that if you are most of the core and also still most of 2.1 is still just talking about the interaction between OAuth applications and the OAuth server and resource server. So it's talking about the interface between those two. It doesn't actually talk about how resource servers and authorization servers are expected to communicate because sometimes those are just part of the same code base, right? So if you're writing like an OAuth system from or an API from scratch and you're building an OAuth, then those it doesn't matter how they talk to each other because they're part of the same code base. Like GitHub, for example, has a built-in OAuth server. They do not need to follow any specs to so that their APIs, the resource servers, can know how to validate access tokens, right? Because it's all just their decision. It's only useful to have that spec. It's only useful to have that kind of spec defined if you are going to have those two pieces deployed separately, especially if they're made by different companies, which is the case with Okta, of course, since Okta is coming in providing an OAuth server. You don't get access to the database, you don't get access to the code. So we need some sort of interface. We need some sort of way to say, here's how you can validate access tokens. And as far as OAuth core is concerned, it doesn't care, right? Like anybody, like you can make up whatever you want for as far as how those resource servers would validate them. However, it's useful to have standards for that because then we can make libraries for it and then things are more interoperable. So that's really the motivation for that, both the introspection response as well as JSON Web Token access tokens.
Interesting. I did not know that before. I would have assumed that introspection was part of core, but it makes sense. And I guess in the early days of OAuth, we were probably talking more about the authorization server and the resource server being part of the same stack more than now.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, because it's
Neat.
only yeah the right because the APIs were still relatively a new concept when OAuth was still being made, right? The fact that random companies would have APIs, right? It wasn't super common. There were like API companies, but for just random companies to start building APIs was kind of a new thing, and I don't think that it was anticipated that there would then be this model of OAuth servers as a service, right? It wasn't necessarily a design goal at the beginning, but one of the reasons that it was written that way was so that that is a possibility. And then as soon as that became more common of having either open source projects that are just an OAuth server or companies providing OAuth servers, then you need things like introspection response or the structured access tokens.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, pretty good. We're 10 minutes in and I've already learned something new.
Great. Yeah, so that's OAuth 2.1. Not a ton of new updates on that this week, but that is something. There is actually someone did actually chime in with a lot of feedback on the draft, which I have yet to actually properly process because we weren't explicitly asking for feedback necessarily. We were mostly saying, all right, does anybody have any issues if we were to ask for a call for adoption? That was the real question. So we'll probably not do another update until this is actually brought into the group.
Has there been any feedback on this introduction and use of the credentialed client type?
Oh yeah.
so far?
I
We talked about that a bit last week.
right. This is probably the biggest change that the spec is making, even though it's not really a change because um, it's just sort of it's adding a new term, but it's not adding a new concept. Um, but still, adding a new term is something. There
Right.
were some comments on the thread about that, but let me see if I can.
Well, while
Let me
you're
see
looking, I
if
would say that it's adding some precision to existing language that, you know, would benefit from tightening up a bit.
yeah. Oh yeah, the comment was we might want to add more context around it. So either like a
Hmm.
specific example of a credentialed client, especially actually because now that I think about it, um, there is this section in oops, there we go. There's a section in client types. Yes. This specification was designed around the following client profiles. None of these are credentialed clients because these are from OAuth
Ah,
2. Um,
right.
and these are some nice concrete examples of, web application is a confidential client. There's a concrete example of what that is. Browser-based application is a public client. So it would probably be beneficial to include an example of a credentialed client as well. Um, and there was also some um, notes about how to deal with, um, or not how to deal with, about what exactly this means. Their identity has not been confirmed. So I think really this just could benefit from a little bit more clarity, but
Hmm.
overall, people did seem to understand the reason for bringing this term into it.
Nice.
Yeah. Yeah. So um, that's OAuth 2.1. Um, what else? Talk about this Microsoft blog post that just came up.
Yeah, that'd be good. We talked for just a minute beforehand about that. I hadn't heard about it yet.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's
Yeah,
not
that'd
like
be good. We talked for.
it's not a new thing necessarily. Um, but Microsoft did just post this yesterday. It's essentially a blog post talking about the warnings of um, OAuth phishing, or I guess what they're calling consent phishing. And this is um, a description of basically what we've talked about in the past about the Google example, where the Google Docs OAuth worm was essentially an example of OAuth phishing. And I use this in my talks as well all the time. But the idea is that a legitimate, like someone actually does register a real application, starts a real OAuth flow. There's no protocol hacks going on. They just trick somebody into clicking accept on this screen, right? So, and then oftentimes, let's see if I can make it bigger. Oftentimes these will request a lot of permissions, right? Like read your mail, send mail as you, read your contacts, and then they use those APIs to go and continue spreading. Um, or stealing data, like reading files. So yeah, it's interesting to me that this is sort of going around again, this idea, because this type of attack is not new. We've seen it now many times. In fact, I think it even made some headlines um, a couple of actually, I don't even know how long time is weird. Was it months or maybe it was a year ago? Um, But Microsoft, I think, had another round of headlines go around about like a again OAuth worm or whatever you want to call it, affecting them the same way it did Google earlier.
Is there any sort of
Um,
incident tied to this latest blog post? Did something happen, or did somebody just decide it's a good idea to bring this up again?
Yeah, it's not clear if this is directly in response to something or just sort of a general um, increased number of phishing attacks in general because everyone is working from home now, and that is everyone is more stressed out and more just willing to click through whatever to make their thing work. Um, but I hadn't heard about anything like in particular that was sort of big or significant. It could just be that there's just a lot of this stuff going around right now.
Right. It's interesting that
Um,
they used a picture of their own consent form with a ton of permissions requested. In the past, part of the failing in the past was that, um, you know, uh, Google had the author hidden behind a drop down, and I think
yeah,
they've all improved their consent forms since then, all the different providers. But it might be interesting to look at, say, Google and Microsoft and maybe some other big ones and just see what kind of review process they have or what their consent forms look like now and, areas where there might still be some problematic UI elements. Certainly see
yeah.
if you see a large number of scopes requested, that may be a flag, but I wonder, like what the minimum number of write scopes you could request that would get by people.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea, and that's actually one of the there's another spec, of course, talking about this, but the idea of incremental authorization, so that instead of the app asking for all the permissions up front, it actually asks for just a small number to start with, and then the user logs in, and then when the app wants to go do something else, like the first time they're going to go upload a file, it would then go back to the OAuth flow requesting the additional scope. And the idea there is that you can increase your conversions because if your first request does not intimidate people, if it's just like, oh, I'm just trying to get you to log in, they're more likely to complete that versus being prompted by a screen that's asking for 20 permissions to different things. Um, and we've seen that on iOS and Android too. That's not OAuth, but just on those platforms natively, making changes to better support that kind of more fine-grained permission and also
Step
not
up.
bombarding the user with those pop-ups. Um, and yeah, so I wonder if at some point it'll start making sense to actually put limits on how many scopes can be requested in one go, and then force
Yeah, I
people to
know
do
in the
incremental.
context of browser extensions, this has nothing to do with OAuth, but at least with Google's review process, once you start requesting broader access to the browser, the review time starts going up, pretty sharply.
Yeah,
Now, I don't know if that means a human being is looking at it or what, but um, I wonder if Microsoft or Google or anybody else, has a statement on like what their review process is or extra hurdles you have to go through. If you want to read somebody's contacts, it's one thing, but if you want to be able to write those contacts, maybe there's an additional validation or hurdle or something you have to go through.
yeah. I wonder. That speaking of, actually, that's a good segue. The One of the reasons this is a problem, or actually the only way this would be a problem is if it's possible for someone unknown to show up and register an OAuth app at your service, right? So with public APIs, this is a problem. Like Google has, it's open. You can go get a Google account, go to the developer portal, register an app, and get a client ID and client secret. Um, Although they actually have now locked this process down a ton ever since that phishing worm. Um, but it's still true with like GitHub and even Twitter. Those are relatively open. Uh, this is not a problem if you control all of the client IDs that get issued. So for Okta customers, for example, typically there is an administrator, at the Okta, at the organization that is handling the Okta account, and they're the ones that decide which client IDs are issued. So it's not really possible for someone who's outside of the organization to show up and get a client ID to then do a phishing attack, which is somewhat reassuring, but it's because it's not an open system, it's not an open API, right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, well, it's always good to keep in mind. Keep stay safe out there and watch what you click because yeah, there's a lot of people trying to take advantage of everybody being remote right now. What else is in the news? The OAuth news.
Good question.
Something else you wanted to
What
talk
is
about?
Yeah, I was poking around and trying to understand, not to, kind of call them out, but I was trying to understand Twitter's kind of dogged adherence to OAuth 1A and
Mm,
why they are reluctant to go all the way over to OAuth 2. They have some support for OAuth 2 now, but it's only for very specific types of interactions. It's mostly still OAuth 1A. So I was trying to understand the differences between the two because I only have ever really kind of dug into OAuth 2. I didn't have a lot of background and context for OAuth 1 or 1A, and trying to understand why it's important to Twitter. And are there any other holdouts? I know I only ever think of Twitter, but is anybody else still, for whatever reason, stuck on OAuth 1A?
yeah, that's an interesting one. The so OAuth 1 and OAuth 2 are completely different things and like 100% not compatible. They barely even share terminology. Um, things are very different. The
Is it like Java and JavaScript?
maybe not that bad.
Yeah.
uh, but OAuth 2 was created to replace OAuth 1 because of all the problems with OAuth 1, and there's a lot of limits with OAuth 1. It was not designed with mobile phones in mind, for example. So it requires a client secret. It's not called a client secret. It's called a geez, now I forget some sort of secret or key or
Hmm.
something. Like the names weren't even good, but the it requires a secret issued to the application, which means if you put it in a mobile app, it's not a secret anymore because you've just put it into the app store and now everybody who downloads it has the secret. This was the Twitter API keys were leaked from all their own apps. It was a bunch of tech press went around about that a long time ago. Um, so there were clear problems with it. The other main problem with it was that because it used that key and access token came in two parts. Also, one part was a key. Every actual API request was signed. So uh, this is actually this gets back to our first point. Um, interestingly, so you get your access token, you get your client secret issue, you get your access token, then you go talk to the API, the resource server, and you have to sign that request. That means the resource server has to also know those two keys in order to validate the request. So it has to be able to check the signature, which essentially means that there's a very tight coupling between the resource server and the OAuth server. And in the case of the initial APIs this was based around, it was fine because it was like Twitter and Flickr and um, even early Google.
Mhm.
Actually, I don't know if they ever implemented OAuth 1. They may have done their own thing until OAuth 2. Um, but anyway, the that tight coupling was the problem of it now is a huge limitation on your architecture of your own API. And So not to mention the problems developers had in actually creating the signed requests, because you had to like, um, so if you're making like a post request form encoded, you had to then sort your parameters alphabetically in order to create the canonical version of them in order to sign that. So like when you're signing something, you have to have a canonical representation of it. So yeah, you have to sort your parameters alphabetically, turn that into a string, sign that string, put that somewhere, so the resource server could then unpack it and do the same thing and check the signature. It was not a good algorithm, and it was very easy to get wrong. And that was a lot of developers' frustrations with OAuth, was that it was hard to get that right. So what ended up happening is like, with Twitter is you would end up with the one Python library or the one PHP library that figured it out, got the signature signing right, and then everybody uses that code. And that's not really a good spec, right? It's not a sign of a good spec if there's only one implementation in the language. It's ideally, easy enough to write that the creating the implementation is not the hurdle. So, um, yeah, so those are some of the main differences between OAuth 1 and OAuth 2. So OAuth 2 ended up dropping the whole idea of signing requests to the API, right? That is simpler for developers. That's where the idea of bearer tokens come from, of let's just make access tokens a string as far as the app is concerned, and the app just sends the string along. It also decouples the resource server and the OAuth server so that those now can be implemented either as a tight coupling or as a flexible, decoupled, which turns out was a great idea because it's meant that we can have things like OAuth servers as a service. So Twitter was early involved in OAuth. It was engineers at Twitter creating OAuth 1, and they actually managed to implement OAuth 1 for their API, which was great. But then they just sort of stopped there. And they haven't really upgraded to OAuth 2. Although if you do look at Twitter OAuth API, if you look this up, you will see references to OAuth. This is great. The Google summary. OAuth 1.0a and OAuth 2 bearer token. But if you look at this,
I felt like this
Twitter
was a bait and switch. I got so excited when they were going to support OAuth 2, and then it turned out to be this.
Exactly. I was like, oh, they finally implemented OAuth 2. No, it turns out OAuth 2 bearer token is the application-only authentication method. This is specific to the application. It does not involve any users. So that means this is essentially the only the client credentials grant. So
that's it.
This is based on the client credentials grant of the OAuth 2 spec. OAuth 1 is still required to issue requests on behalf of users. So essentially, this isn't really a flow. The client credentials grant is, I feel like, overcomplicated by most documentation, because it's just you make a post request with your client ID and your client secret, and you get back an access token. There's not much else to it. These lines make it look way more complicated than it is.
Right.
So yeah, bummer that they. Oh yeah, this is what it was called: consumer key and consumer secret. So this is basically the client ID, and that's the client secret.
And there's like a request token and an access token.
Access token and access token secret key or something. It's the terms are not good. But anyway, so yeah, they added OAuth 2 bearer token support just for the client credentials grant, which I don't know why they did it this way, because like honestly, the client credentials grant is so minimal that it's not even really worth supporting if that's all you're gonna be doing with OAuth 2. You might as well just call it your own thing and use the terms you already have. But yeah, so they've stuck with OAuth 1. Um, I'm not an engineer at Twitter. I have never been. I only know a handful of people who work there. So it's anybody's guess as to why they haven't updated to OAuth 2. Um, Definitely do not have any sort of insider knowledge on that. But my guess is that it's just because this already exists and it's not broken, right?
Right.
Like it's not great that it doesn't really work for mobile apps, but they also kind of killed off their third-party developer community a long time ago, so that's not really a priority for them. And uh, yeah, that's
So does their own mobile
it's.
app use something proprietary at this point? If not OAuth 1.8, or did they figure out the key problem for mobile?
I'm not actually sure if they are using
Hmm.
this or not on their mobile apps. I know they were at one point, um, but I also suspect it's probably impossible to reverse engineer because they're probably doing cert pinning at this point. I know I would if I were them.
Right.
I haven't actually tried to intercept it to reverse engineer it. Um, yeah, so it'd be nice if they upgraded, but just because it'd be a lot easier to write Twitter apps, but then they don't really want people to write Twitter apps, so it's not really a priority, right? Like the reason to upgrade to OAuth 2 is because it's so much simpler for developers, and also it's more secure if you are, going through all the layers properly. But they don't really need to be friendly to developers because that's not their priorities. Um,
Right.
Other people who still implement OAuth 1, ironically, Flickr recently updated to OAuth 1. So Flickr was also
Huh.
part of developing OAuth and
Right.
never actually implemented OAuth 1 themselves until a couple of years ago. Um, and they finally launched support for for OAuth. And now I'm wondering what the date was because it might actually be a while ago now.
I was just
Does
looking
that
at
have it?
their docs. It
Does that
doesn't
have
have
it?
a date on it, but it goes through. It's clearly an OAuth 1 flow.
Yeah, they finally. So before they were using their own thing they made up, which was uh, okay, this can't be right. I'm apparently just like I don't know where. Okay, this is the blog post. Look at the
Wow.
date,
2011.
2011. I just said recently, and this does. I remember this blog post coming out, and it doesn't feel that long ago.
Yeah.
Um, but okay, so if you think about the timeline of this, though, OAuth 1 was like 2007, 2008. OAuth 2 was published in 2012, October.
2012. Yeah.
But the drafts have been worked on uh, since. Can we get to the history here? Yes. First draft of OAuth 2 was April 2010. So this is why it stuck out in my head though, because OAuth 2 was being worked on, and then in 2011, which is I think sometime around here,
In
yeah,
between. Yeah.
mid, 16 drafts later, they announced support for OAuth 1 instead of like implementing this. So I don't know why they did that, and now they're still on OAuth 1. Um,
You said earlier time is a funny thing. 8 years seems like forever in internet time, but it also at the
yeah,
same time seems like, it's not that long that OAuth 2 has been around. 8 years in empirical terms is not that long,
right.
but it is super long in internet time.
Yeah, yeah, funny. Um, but
Interesting.
yeah, I think that changing the authentication and authorization is such a core part of an API that ripping that out and replacing it with something else is a very large project, and also not really any visible effects. Often you don't get like a lot of flashy things to show for it. So I feel like it's way down on the priority list of a lot of people of like, well, this works, even if it's not perfect. So why would we bother updating? Which is also why OAuth, which is why I was interested in doing OAuth 2.1, because even though this OAuth 3 thing, or whatever it's going to end up being called, is being worked on in the works, very interesting, has some good ideas. It's not like OAuth 2 is going away anytime soon. People are going to still have to learn about OAuth 2 for a very long time. So I
Yeah,
do want to make that easier for people to understand.
right.
Yeah.
With just as kind of since you brought up, beyond OAuth 2.1, is there anything that stands out as something that has like significant support in the community, but is significantly different than what you would find in OAuth 2 today? Like somebody said, like here's a feature we're talking about in OAuth XYZ, and people are like, yeah, we really need that. Or is it not, is there nothing like, I guess I'm looking for something that's like, a significant departure or something significantly new or some lesson learned from OAuth that they want to evolve with.
Yeah. So I think one of the drivers for OAuth 3 or XYZ or whatever you're calling it right now um, is reducing the reliance on the assumption that there is a browser. So uh, like OAuth 2, the device flow is a clever way around this, right? But everything else in OAuth assumes that the application is running on a device that has a browser available, and that the application can interact with that browser, right, by opening it and then catching a response from it. And on a desktop environment and even in a mobile phone, that's fine. But once we get into Internet of Things, or like the home automation systems and smart speakers, um, and even smart TVs that don't have browsers, that assumption falls down pretty quick. The device flow is a pretty clever way around it, because it is an extension of OAuth 2, so it's easy to add to an OAuth 2 system, and it does not rely on a browser existing on the device that ends up with the access token. But that is also very much like patched on top, right? Patched on top of OAuth. It's not
Right.
necessarily something you
And it
would go about
does,
designing that way from scratch.
right. It kind of kicks the can down the street because a browser is required somewhere, just not on that device.
Yeah, yeah. So I think that's one of the principles that OAuth 3 is trying to really address. And along those lines, there's people working on other embedded devices or small systems that even the sort of network stack that's required to do HTTPS is too much for these devices. So they're looking at like alternate transports. So
Hmm.
if you imagine like microcontroller devices, like, okay, yeah, you can buy a ESP32 chip and it has the ability to make HTTP requests on it. But that is kind of an exception, and it's actually a pretty powerful device, even though it's only $9. Um, there are smaller, less powerful, cheaper chips out there that are doing things, and you need to get those enrolled in the system and have some sort of authentication on those as well. And those may not have an HTTP stack on them. So in those cases, we're talking about like MQTT or other transports, where you then need to somehow get some sort of access token thing into it. But now looking at OAuth, it's very much bound to TLS, HTTP, and the concepts there would be probably possible to translate into alternate transports, but you start very quickly losing any benefit by doing that because the security model of those alternate transports were not considered in OAuth. So that's there's definitely some people looking from that side of things looking at OAuth 3 or GNAP or TxAuth. It has like 5 names right now. Looking at that and seeing if there's a way to take advantage of those concepts and baking in these alternate transports into the beginning of it.
On the XYZ page, it talks about all these other standards that are informing the work on it, including OIDC. Do you think it's a goal to have it be completely standalone for both authorization and authentication? Like if this is successful in its mission,
Yeah.
would it be the only standard you need, sort of thing?
This is definitely a discussion that happened in the charter discussion when the charter of the group was created. And um, the I'm trying to think of if I can find the charter now because yes, um, this ended up getting written into here. You would not believe the amount of discussion that went into choosing all of this text. So this is a description of the new working group that's creating this new protocol. It's not happening in the OAuth working group, right? It's happening in this working group called GNAP. I believe that's supposed to be the official pronunciation of it. Also, man, that was the whole thing of deciding that name. But okay, so it will expand upon the use cases currently supported by OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect. Okay, expand on the use cases. And then down here it says, will define extension points. Oh no, not that one. I guess, so yeah, extension points for defining, for conveying user information. Okay. And
It does
there's
say,
also
I
one
just caught
here.
where it says the group will attempt to simplify migrating from OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect to the new protocol.
Yep.
So it sounds like they're saying they want to provide a pathway for which you can use this protocol without having to use OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect anymore.
So yeah, so the short answer is so because OpenID Connect, at least the mechanism, the flows, those are all extensions of OAuth flows. All of the OAuth flows are going away in this world, right? Like they have no standing in this world. This world is making up their own flows, which means none of the OpenID Connect flows make any sense in this world either. So the idea is that it should also be able to take the place of the uses of OpenID Connect. This was actually one of the things I wanted to make sure was in the charter was, I was trying to find the text of it, but I wanted to make sure that what got into the charter was that identity is in scope of this group to address in some way. Not like deciding necessarily new vocabularies for it, but that I didn't want this to only be used for authorization, right? Because then OpenID Connect would still, you would have to somehow fit OpenID Connect next to this if you were using this, which then wouldn't make any sense, right? So one of the I actually wrote a blog post about this, and this was one of the things I want to make sure was in the charter so that we could have this discussion about this blog post in the group. And my argument here was, yeah, while OAuth was never intended to communicate information about a user, OAuth was always just about getting an access token to hit APIs. It turns out that almost always the first thing an application does after it gets an access token is it goes and hits the user in endpoint and figures out who just logged in, right? So if you look at GitHub or Instagram or Twitter, they're all OAuth, and they, even in their own docs, they will walk you through this example of, okay, you've got the access token. Now go look up the user's information at the user endpoint. Figure out who just logged in, because applications want to know that. And my argument is, I think this is an unnecessary extra step because I often don't actually care about the entire profile info. I probably just need, at the very least, a unique ID, because I want to be able to store some user record in my side of the transaction to know who just logged in. I probably want their name. And so my argument here was, well, let's just add that into the spec from the beginning. So if we look at the XYZ proposal, then this is an example of in OAuth, this would be using the authorization code to get the access token. It looks a little different here. But
Right.
you make that post request to go get the access token. And then instead of getting back just the access token, you also get back information about the user. Why not, right? Like you could do this in OAuth as well. Maybe just for the heck of it, I should stir up some trouble by suggesting an extension to OAuth that returns user information in the authorization in the token response, just for fun. But the idea here would be like, okay, you got the access token. Instead of making you make another request, why not just return the user info right there? And you could go either like just ID or also return an endpoint to fetch it from if you needed to, fetch the full profile info. Anyway, I just laid out a
Right.
few different options here. But my goal with this was like, okay, this is part of the space. I want to make sure that in the charter, we make sure that identity is in scope so that we can discuss this and discuss the specifics of what it looks like. Because I was worried that if we didn't get that into the charter, then anytime I tried to bring it up later, people would just be like, oh, well, this is out of scope. We can't talk about identity because OpenID Connect has already solved it. Right. So
Right. Yeah, I
um,
like that assertion that identity has always been a part of OAuth, and what OpenID Connect gave us was, an agreed upon endpoint at least. But, like you're saying, you could solve for identity in a bunch of different ways without having to have a whole separate spec necessarily. And one that, like we're already seeing in the OAuth 2.1 effort, like an impedance mismatch where, if OAuth 2.1 is released, what's the impact on OpenID Connect? And how is that standard gonna then update itself to, be in conformance? And that's generated a whole bunch of conversation that maybe is technically unnecessary if it's all under one roof.
yeah, and I think part of that is because it is two separate organizations, and one of them has a paid membership structure, so has to do a little bit of work to justify sticking around.
Yeah.
Um, but OpenID Connect is more than just the user info endpoint. It's doing a bunch of different things.
Yeah, fair enough.
It's a vocabulary of claims. So you could use that same vocabulary in the response about the user. Um, but it's also ID tokens also, they're not just conveying user information. It's also a signed token. So that means you can actually do more things with it, like pass it around or use it as a cookie or whatever, right? So it's doing a few more things than just adding identity into OAuth. Um, but I want to make sure that at least the very minimal use case of who just logged in, like return some sort of user ID to the application, I want to make sure that's in the core of whatever OAuth 3 is. And then if you need
Right.
the features that OpenID Connect adds on top of that, then yeah, by all means, like let's figure out just how they can continue to extend OAuth to add those features. But
Right.
for just the core use case, I think it's important to have it be part of the core.
Yeah.
Now I am getting tempted to write up an extension that adds user. I could even make it add OpenID Connect claims into the token response, just to really muddy the waters.
Yep, that you could.
Actually, it's
I do
actually one
like
of
the
the
idea of not having a separate request also. Like to have it
yeah.
all come
Well,
back in one request, that'd be great.
I do this demo in my workshops all the time of you know if you don't want to use the implicit flow to get access tokens, of course. So you're going to use the authorization code flow with Pixie, please. And if you do that, then using the hybrid response modes makes almost no sense because why bother getting the ID token back in the redirect, but then get the access token after a post request, right? It doesn't really buy you anything because you also have to verify the ID token then by fetching the key. So um, instead, if you use the response type code, authorization code response, and get both your access token and your ID token from the token endpoint, which is something that you can do in OpenID Connect, um, essentially you can then treat the ID token as the worst possible encoding of JSON data because all you really care about is the JSON data inside that middle chunk of the ID token. You don't need the signature anymore because you already know where it came from. So all you do is you take that ID token string, you drop the surrounding, the header and the signature, then it's base64 encoded JSON, so you base64 decode it, then you JSON decode it, right? So at that point, all you've really done is just added 3 decoding steps into this serialization format, and you may as well have just returned the claims directly. So that would be my proposal, would be to um, create an extension that just returns the user info directly as JSON data already in next to the access token, so that it's not wrapped up in the ID token. And then again, that doesn't solve every use case. Like there's plenty of use cases that do need an ID token in that response, but the simple use cases do not need it to be an ID token. They just need the user info.
Right. Makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, the stuff that we've talked about up until now is a good tie-in maybe in the last bunch of minutes. And we can look at some questions too. But we're talking about some of the differences between OAuth 1 and 2 and dropping that encryption requirement. And OAuth 2 really relies on the transport as being having the security necessary enough, right? So TLS and
Yep.
SSL. So I thought we might touch on that as kind of maybe the unsung hero of OAuth 2. And just this week, I've been focusing a lot on Let's Encrypt and CertBot and Zero SSL and all these services that have made it kind of civilized to deal with SSL certs. And just as an aside, I'm trying to remember the year, but it was something like, I want to say it was maybe 1999, and I was working at a bank, and I had to go to an actual notary to get a stamp on a piece of paper in order to get an SSL cert for this bank. That was like part of the
Wow.
process to prove, and then of course I had to pony up $2,000, or the bank did, of course, but it was not, it was an expensive and even had paper involved process to get an SSL cert. And look at where we are today, where you have things like CertBot that can just automatically renew for you.
That's something.
Yeah.
Notarized SSL certs. Yeah.
It was all about like proving, that you own this domain, and there were no automated, DNS bots or anything like that to verify that you'd added something to the DNS record that we have today. So I don't know. It's kind of interesting to see how far we've come, and even I mean, Let's Encrypt is even 5 years ago. It was still like really arduous to and expensive often to get an SSL cert. And
Yeah,
now it's
Let's
like,
Encrypt
who's
really did
paying for
just,
SSL certs anymore?
yeah, they really just threw a wrench into that whole industry. And you still can pay for SSL certs if you do want the identity verification part of it. But most people don't care about that aspect of it. Most people are using it for transport security.
Yeah.
But yeah,
And I
OAuth,
was
the
pretty
entire model of OAuth 2 relies on transport security, so it's definitely a critical for that.
right. Yeah, and so it's it's been an interesting path to follow to look at of course we work for Okta, so I'm looking at, what does it take to get a custom domain so that you can do interesting things with it for Okta. And I was just impressed with how far the whole industry has come along to be able to do that. So if you're, and it ties back to OAuth. If you're writing an app and you want it to support OAuth and you want to use an external service provider, or you want to use something open source like Keycloak, it's a lot easier now than it used to be to have that critical
Mhm.
piece of infrastructure, which is the SSL cert.
Yeah, I've been pretty happy with using Let's Encrypt. It's I have it set up the same way. I think I'm still using the exact same method I set up like 3 or 4 years ago, so that's a good sign. Um, Although when they launched wildcard certs, that uses the DNS verification instead of the HTTP verification, and I am really excited about that. But that's a pretty big change to the workflow I have set up, so I need to still work on that for a couple of my domains. But yeah,
Right.
wildcard certs are great. I used to actually spend money on those um, back when like right before Let's Encrypt was launching, you could get a cert for like $9 at a couple of places that were like super discounted, and it was like, oh, that's awesome. But if you wanted the wildcard cert, it was like 10 times that still.
Right.
But now it's all free, so that's great.
Yep. Yeah, I was just looking, like I have no affiliation or connection to Zero SSL, but even their paid service is like it works out to like $80 a year, and then you can have you know, uh, 3 different 1-year certificates. You don't even have to go and like
Mm.
refresh them with a cron job. That being said, it's so easy to refresh every 90 days, and there's so many good articles and support for it. I still don't know why you would want to go and want to go and pay for it. It's not
Yep.
until you go
Yep.
up a paid tier that you can get like wildcard certs. But one thing I will say that I bumped up against, again, this is kind of tangential to OAuth, but um, when you really want to get into it, like with wildcard certs or just what's, um, kind of, if you want to do something tricky or fancy, it really needs to be DNS. And as long as I've worked with DNS, to my surprise, I don't know why it surprised me, there's just no standard way to interact with DNS service providers. They're all doing their own
Yeah.
thing. So there's, I don't know, 10 or 12 plugins to certbot to, if you want to use DNS transport, to be able to work with individual providers. And it just kind of left me scratching my head. I'm surprised that nobody's come up with a standard way to interact with DNS after all these years.
Like a DNS API for managing records. I wonder why. I mean, I guess because the
Yeah,
core of DNS is pull based, where um, like you set up a zone that will pull records from the main one, um, and that's done through like whatever protocol that is, which is the
right,
opposite of an API, which where you'd be like pushing records to it. It's like,
right. And
but yeah, it
yeah,
seems like
the,
that's a
the
would be good to
whole
standardize.
Yeah, and the whole idea of even needing to push records to DNS on like a regular basis is fairly new.
I suppose so.
Like
Yeah.
various record types for verification and such. It's kind of ingenious, but it also exposes kind of uh, a weak spot for automation.
Yep. Yep. Well, we've reached the top of the hour, and I feel like that was a good conversation.
Yeah,
Um,
man.
I will go. I'm gonna go take some notes on this and update the timestamps of this video. 'Cause I feel like we stayed on topic pretty well. I had a couple of nice recurring themes here. So, um, yeah, for those of you watching live, thanks for joining. For those of you watching later, thanks for watching. And looking forward to it. We'll be back again soon.
That's good.